The next topic we are talking about in relation to catching is anticipation. And this is involved in many manipulative skills, not just catching. But there's a lot of things that have to be anticipated if we're specifically talking about catching, which we are. Um, so much of the anticipation has to do with body scaling and perceptual abilities. So we might be looking at how the object's physical characteristics line up with our individual characteristics. We could look at the object's movement characteristics, comparison between individual and object, individual and task, or we could also look at the comparison of task and object characteristics. So this is very null model heavy, but usually we look at anticipation with coincidence anticipation tasks, which are motor skills in which a person anticipates the completion of a movement to coincide with the arrival of a moving object. So usually catching would be a great example of this. And there are disadvantages to researching these types of tasks, mostly because they're typically conducted in a laboratory setting to control for task and environmental constraints. Thus, the implications of results might be more related to the perceptual limits of an individual and their interception abilities rather than what might actually happen in the real world. But individuals are typically going to be proficient by their teen years in performance of these coincidence anticipation tasks, and task constraints are going to heavily influence the accuracy. So some of the variables we could observe leading to lower accuracy might include a smaller ball size, right? So similar to throwing, if we manipulated the target such that we have a small target versus a larger target, accuracy demands are increased with a smaller target. So in this case, it's the reverse, where they're catching a smaller target, and that is what increases the accuracy demands. We also have decreased accuracy with or when there's a greater required movement complexity. So if there are more movements involved in the resultant movement pattern, the individual is likely to be less accurate. Greater distance to the interception point also leads to lower accuracy. So if the individual has to adjust to the flight of the ball over a longer distance, accuracy tends to go down. Objects that have a higher trajectory are less accurately intercepted than objects with lower trajectories, specifically with respect to the orientation of the performer's body. And then finally, ball color contrast with the environmental background is another factor to consider. So if we had a light-colored ball going in a light-colored background, it's a little bit harder to distinguish the boundaries of the projected object, which can interfere with how we interpret the timing of contact with that object. Speaking of vision, another important factor in successful anticipation and interception is having a developed optic array. This is also sometimes referred to as optic flow, and it's defined as the picture that is captured by the photoreceptors in binocular vision. So we have an image over here on the right. In your eye, you have your retina. The retina is the innermost layer of cells, and you have photoreceptors that process light. And that how they process light ends up creating what is known as a retinal image. Okay, so optic flow is the change of the image that falls on the retina in relation to how environmental characteristics are changing. And this optic array can be modified as the individual moves throughout the environment, the objects move within the environment, or kind of a combination of both. Usually the changes in the retinal image are either going to expand, constrict, or remain the same. And we can gather information about how our environment is moving or how we're moving in the environment based on these different properties. So objects that appear to expand typically are going to be moving closer to the individual. Objects moving further away usually constrict or get smaller. And then objects that appear to stay constant in size, there's several different things that could be happening. Likely, or more likely, is that the object rate of movement is the same as the individual. So objects could be stationary when the individual is stationary, in which case nobody's moving. Or the object could be moving at the same rate and in the same direction as the individual. It could also be the case that the object is moving in a perpendicular plane to the individual, so maybe we have a target moving side to side, but there's no. I'm dumb. I was thinking I could move my mouse towards you guys, but this is not a three-dimensional space, so I take it back. But if an object is moving side to side, it's neither expanding nor constricting, so we know it's not getting closer or moving further away from us. But being able to interpret this optic array or using visual perception is key in being able to accurately anticipate when the individual will come in contact with the object in the environment. So if we look at catching as an example, a ball being thrown at an individual as would be, well, at least the optic array would pick up that the rate of expansion of the ball moving towards the individual, the ball is getting bigger, right? From the optic array, if we have our hand in our visual field, we can see how the hand is moving towards the object. So in addition to seeing the ball expanding in our optic array, we might also see our hand constricting or getting smaller as it moves away from our body to meet the object. So those are a couple examples of how we use the optic array in anticipation type tasks. As far as catching in older adults, there's not a whole lot of research on this. I just thought this photo was funny, but perhaps that's why. I have a feeling he probably fell over the rail. I shouldn't laugh at that. That's horrible. Anyways, usually the declines in performance that we see in catching are mostly due to individual constraints, which is not super different from the locomotor tasks and the ballistic tasks we've looked at. So older adulthood, typically individual constraints are the thing that lead to decline in performance. But different things that we might notice is movement speed is slower. The ability to reach might be impacted if there's joint pain or limits in joint range of motion. Also, activity level. If a person's not really interacting with catching type activities anymore, they're not really likely to be good at them. The actual skill doesn't go away, but usually we're going to end up seeing lower accuracy in catching as well as greater movement variability. So this kind of highlights that practice might be a factor in the maintenance of skill level. We don't necessarily lose the ability to catch. It's kind of like riding a bike. We still maintain the coincident timing, and maybe we're able to perceive our environment in a way that we could accurately move to the object. It's just that maybe we don't practice that skill such that our performances are good from every trial to every trial. As a summary of this lecture, these are some key points that you might have pulled out. So the first being that manipulative skills set humans apart from other species, specifically because we have opposable thumbs that afford us the opportunity to do a wide variety of tasks compared to other mammalian species. Children are usually accomplished catchers by about 11 or 12 years old. But catching tasks that have greater complexity, again, usually defined by a greater number of task constraints, are typically considered more difficult. Practice is critical for both skill development as well as skill maintenance. So in terms of development, right, children need a lot of practice for motor learning, but as the example of older adults, practice might also be needed for skill maintenance. Finally, the effects of aging are likely to affect movement towards a projectile more than it affects the manipulative aspects of catching. So in terms of aging, it probably is going to affect getting to the object or adjusting the body more than the actual accuracy that the person is capable of. All right, that concludes our lecture videos for this week. If you guys have any questions on this content, please feel free to reach out to me via email.